Imagine a place where sleep is forbidden, where the human mind is pushed past its limits, and where curiosity becomes a doorway to unimaginable horror. In the late 1940s, a group of Russian researchers reportedly conducted an experiment that tested the very boundaries of human endurance, denying 5 political prisoners sleep for 15 days straight. What began as a study on stamina and willpower descended into a nightmare that would challenge the very definition of sanity. Tonight, we'll uncover the terrifying details, the gruesome transformations, and the haunting final moments that were reportedly witnessed in that isolated lab. Brace yourself as we dive into a tale where fear, science, and obsession collide, and where the line between human and monster blurs into darkness. By the end, you'll be questioning the limits of your own mind and the shadows that linger when sleep refuses to arrive. In a remote research facility, 5 political prisoners were chosen for a sleep deprivation study. These subjects were promised freedom if they survived. But little did they know, they were entering a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Each prisoner was placed in a sealed chamber, outfitted with microphones and cameras, and provided with only minimal rations. The researchers injected a stimulant gas designed to keep them awake for the entire duration, a chemical cocktail that subjects had never experienced. The first few hours were uneventful. Conversation was normal, subjects were alert, and tension was minimal. But as the night stretched on, their behavior began to subtly shift. Nervous laughter turned into quiet paranoia. Minor disagreements sparked disproportionately violent reactions. The researchers, hidden behind one-way glass, noted the first sign of stress: clenched fists, twitching eyes, and the occasional muttered curse. Yet they pressed on, fascinated by how long the human mind could resist exhaustion. By the end of day 1, fatigue began to take hold in subtle ways. Small tremors, dilated pupils, and a restless pacing that never ceased. The hum of the ventilation system, once barely noticeable, became a maddening presence, each breath echoing through the chambers. And while the outside world continued on, inside the lab, a slow, invisible terror was creeping into the minds of men who had never known their own fragility. The experiment had only just begun, but already the air inside those chambers carried a faint, ominous tension. By the 3rd day, the signs of sleep deprivation were undeniable. The subjects' conversation became fragmented, filled with paranoia and erratic bursts of anger. Words twisted in incoherence. Sentences repeated themselves like broken records. One prisoner reportedly began whispering to unseen entities, eyes darting to corners of the chamber that contained nothing. The researchers documented this with clinical fascination, noting the subtle degradation of rational thought. Physically, the effects were horrifying. Eyes were bloodshot and glassy, skin pale and clammy, muscles twitching uncontrollably. Tremors ran through the prisoners with increasing intensity. A constant scratching at the walls and floor became part of their ritual, a futile attempt to anchor themselves to reality. Even minimal contact with the researchers caused extreme agitation, sometimes violent outbursts that left the cell doors smeared with blood. The stimulant gas, once their only ally, now began to betray them. Their bodies were hyperstimulated, yet exhausted, trapped in a liminal state between awareness and collapse. Sleep, a refuge denied, became an obsession, yet even the thought of closing their eyes triggered terror. The air in the chambers thickened with a suffocating tension, as the walls themselves were alive, pressing down on their minds. The early effects were merely the prelude to the true horror that awaited, where the boundary between human and monster would vanish entirely. By day 6, the chambers had become a theater of madness. The prisoners, once coherent men, now teetered on the edge of psychosis. They spoke in fragmented chants, often repeating phrases with a tone both pleading and accusatory. Their eyes glimmered with an unnatural intensity, reflecting a mind unraveling faster than a body could endure. Attempts at communication became impossible. Even simple instructions provoked extreme panic or rage. Violence became a daily occurrence. Prisoners turned on one another, scratching, biting, screaming with an unrestrained ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. Some refused food, others tore at their own skin, their screams echoing through the labyrinthian facility. The researchers, initially detached, now faced a living nightmare. Observation became a test of endurance for them as well. The human mind, they realized, was far more fragile than anticipated. The gas, a constant stimulant, amplified every emotion, every thought, until paranoia and delusion dominated. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Sounds became distorted echoes of unseen horrors. The prisoners' bodies began to contort in unnatural ways, their screams punctuated by guttural noises that were almost animalistic. It was clear the experiment had crossed a threshold. No longer was this a study of endurance. It had become a window into the darkest corners of human consciousness, a glimpse at what happens when the mind is denied its most basic need. By the 10th day, the experiment had crossed a threshold that neither subjects nor researchers could escape. The chambers had grown eerily silent, where once there had been constant screams, frantic whispers, and violent clashes. Now there was only a suffocating stillness. The prisoners no longer shouted, no longer clawed at the walls. Instead, they sat motionless, bodies trembling, eyes wide and unblinking, as if waiting for something unseen. The researchers, unnerved by the sudden calm, increased their monitoring. What they saw chilled them. The men had begun tearing strips of flesh from their own bodies, arranging them methodically along the floor in grotesque patterns. The microphones picked up only faint mutterings, prayers twisted into something unrecognizable. It was as if the subjects were communing with an entity beyond human comprehension, their voices weaving together in a discordant chant. Attempts to interact triggered only guttural snarls. One prisoner pressed his face against the glass, blood trickling from his mouth, whispering a phrase so faint it was nearly lost in static. "We are awake now, forever." Sleep was no longer denied, it was rejected. The very concept of rest seemed abhorrent to them, as though they had glimpsed a truth in their delirium that made slumber impossible. The researchers, once convinced they were in control, now felt the balance had shifted. The experiment was no longer theirs. Something else had taken root in that chamber, something that fed on exhaustion, fear, and madness. The true horror was no longer the gas. It was what the prisoners had become. By day 15, what remained of the prisoners was barely human. They were hollowed shells of flesh and instinct, consumed by rage, fear, and incomprehensible delusions. One prisoner reportedly tore his own throat open with his bare hands. Another chewed through his fingers in a frenzy. The chamber reeked of blood, sweat, and a lingering chemical odor that no ventilation could remove. When the researchers entered, they were confronted with a scene of utter chaos. Prisoners, or what had once been men, advanced with grotesque snarls, shrieking demands, and incomprehensible words. Their skin bore deep gouges, eyes wild and unblinking. Attempted restraint was met with superhuman strength and a relentless predatory violence. The camera footage, later recovered, captured only fleeting glimpses before the power went out, leaving the room in total darkness. It was in this darkness that the experiment's true horror became evident. The denial of sleep had stripped the prisoners of not just cognition, but humanity itself. Minds fractured, bodies disfigured, and sanity obliterated. The researchers survived, but at a cost. They carried the echoes of screams, the memories of faces twisted beyond recognition, and the knowledge that the human mind has limits even science cannot safely explore. The Russian sleep experiment remains a chilling reminder of how curiosity and obsession can blur the line between study and atrocity. A tale whispered in the dark corners of research lore, where no one dares linger for long. The Russian sleep experiment, whether fully true or exaggerated, endures as one of the most terrifying stories of human obsession and the fragility of the mind. It reminds us that curiosity, when paired with cruelty, can lead to horrors beyond comprehension. As you imagine the isolated chambers, the screaming men, and the shadows that consume them, consider the power of sleep, not merely as rest, but as the very boundary between sanity and madness. Stories like this captivate us because they reflect our deepest fears, that control can be lost, that science can outpace morality, and that the human mind, when pushed too far, can become unrecognizable even to itself. If you felt the dread creeping in as you listened, share this story with someone brave enough to face it. And let us know in the comments, would you survive 15 days awake, trapped in darkness, knowing the mind itself could betray you? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to venture further into the mysteries and horrors lurking just beyond the light. And as always, don't forget to look beyond the fog.